I know I keep saying this, but if you already live in a smart home, you're probably watching the wrong video because I don't. This is the fourth and maybe the last video in a series about trying to monitor some things in my 47-year-old dumb house, where the project finally comes together, or at least I think it did. Hi, I'm Gary. I make videos about technology stuff that happens to interest me, and I publish them in the possibly misguided hope that other people will find them interesting also. As I said, this is the fourth in a series of videos about trying to build a very basic home monitoring system in my older house. It's basic for at least two reasons. One, I'm not trying to control anything, which seems to be the focus of a lot of smart home projects. And two, I'm really only looking at power and energy use and its effect on comfort, really temperature, in my house. It would be fairly easy to extend this project to do other things, and I might do some of that in the future. But I have reached my immediate goal, which, as those of you who have watched the earlier videos know, was just to be able to monitor and record the electrical usage of my heating and air conditioning system, along with the temperature in various spots in my house. It's a pretty limited goal, so I chose a pretty limited tool to do it with, namely an Arduino Rev 3 Uno microcontroller. I know some of you are still thinking, why on earth did you use that underpowered thing when you could have had much more capability for not a lot more money? And the answer to the question is, I'm lazy. I'm cheap. I'm stubborn. And I sometimes enjoy a bit of a challenge. The Uno has an incredible number of software examples available for almost everything it can do, so I didn't have to learn as much programming. The Chinese Arduino clone I'm using actually cost less than $5. And once I started running into its limitations, which I did, it became almost a game to see if I could complete my project using it. So here it is, the poor man's home monitor and data logger. And close to its final configuration. If you saw my last video, you may remember that I attempted to use an off-the-shelf data logger shield that plugged into the Uno and provided a real-time clock and a micro SD card socket. That became a bit of a disaster. The real-time clock was the DS1307, which is notoriously inaccurate. I could have lived with that. But the SD card software used so much of the Uno's very limited memory that my program just kept crashing and produced garbage. And to add insult to injury, the shield then quit working entirely. Since this was just before I was leaving on a 6-week vacation trip, I improvised a temporary arrangement using this much more accurate DS3231 real-time clock module and printing the measurements from my sensors to the Arduino serial monitor. I could then capture them using the PLX DAQ spreadsheet software on a laptop, as I showed in the last video. That system was up and running when I left home, and I hope it still is. But it obviously isn't a desirable arrangement in the long run, because it ties up a computer full-time just collecting the data and saving it. So the challenge for the past 2.5 weeks has been to get around these problems while I'm away from home and all my usual support systems. I'll talk about that a bit more shortly. But first, let me finish describing the process to get to the completed result. I brought along some spare parts on my trip, including another Uno clone, a real-time clock, and a module version of the non-working shield. That let me breadboard a prototype setup on my sister's dining room table, for which I owe her a big vote of thanks. It's actually a bigger and better workspace than I have at home, as long as no one comes to dinner. It did require dummying some things, such as reading several non-existent sensors, and writing to an LCD display that was too small to show all the text I was sending to the larger version at home. But eventually I found that by simplifying my software sketch some, there was actually enough memory on the Uno to support an SD card socket for saving data from all my sensors. The present version of the code ended up with something over 300 bytes of memory still free when it starts up. That's ridiculous when you think of how much memory any modern computer has. But it didn't crash anymore, except when I accidentally jostled the breadboard wires. So, with all the parts working, it was time to construct something without all those dangling wires. Fortunately, Amazon sells these prototyping printed circuit boards where you can mount most anything you desire. You do have to solder the headers with the connecting pins on for yourself. It helps a lot to plug them into something before soldering them to keep the headers from ending up at some odd angle. And if your eyesight is less than perfect and your hands aren't rock steady, which mine aren't, getting the real-time clock and SD card modules soldered into place and connected to the pins with jumper wires is pretty tricky. I tried using a borrowed digital microscope to do my soldering, but the two-dimensional image didn't really work for me. It was useful as a really bright light source for soldering, though, which helped a great deal in getting the shield built, as well as for connecting a new LCD panel. And it let me record some video of the assembly and inspection process, where you can see mostly my hand shaking, but oh well. The end result of this is a handmade shield that includes both a DS3231 real-time clock and a micro SD card socket, and it still has a set of headers for connecting the sensors. My intention is to connect the sensors in my house to these plug-in terminal strips, so there are no breadboard-type wires hanging loose when I'm done. Since I'm not at home, I obviously can't connect them to my actual sensors. But it did manage to scrounge up 4 of the DS18B20 temperature sensors, like the ones I installed in my house earlier, along with one of the PZEM004T power monitor modules. This one is connected to a cut-up extension cord, so I can measure the power of whatever is plugged into it for testing. And I got a larger LCD display from AliExpress to match the one at home. That makes it possible to verify the software with a decent simulation of the final installation. My software is still trying to read 2 power monitors, but since it doesn't get a response from the second one, it redisplays the values from the first one, so I can see that it's working. And it is working. It can write data to the LCD display, along with printing the same values with a date and time stamp to the serial monitor, and saving it to the micro SD card 3 times a minute. All of this using an 8-bit microcontroller that runs 150 times slower than my laptop and has 8 million times less memory. That's largely a testament to the power of modern digital sensor technology. Both the power and temperature sensors provide direct digital outputs to the Arduino with no conversion necessary. And of course it helps a lot that I'm only reading the data at 5-second intervals, which wouldn't be nearly fast enough for some applications. But it does the job for this project, and not only does it fit in this little box, even with 3 stacked layers, there's room in there for a good bit more stuff if I decide to add Wi-Fi or some other kind of network interface. I may do that eventually, just to avoid having to unplug the SD card to get the data from it. In the meantime, I am truly impressed that you can do so much with so little. This is probably a good time to talk about just how little, particularly in terms of cost. Since one of my goals was to do this cheaply, you deserve at least a cost breakdown to see how it turned out. I should throw out at least 2 caveats up front. I started this project with nothing and no knowledge about anything Arduino. Not knowing what I really needed or what would work, I invested in a lot of hardware, much of which turned out to be redundant or not used, or even not usable. And in many cases I bought more than one, or it only came in a multi-unit package. I chalked all that up to the learning experience and to possible future projects. As an example, the first Arduino board I bought was a genuine Uno Rev 4 board that cost $20-something. It's way more powerful than the Rev 3 Uno, and I liked it a lot. But the software library for the power monitors did not work with it. That meant either using a much more complex measurement process or sticking with the slower board, which is what I did. The second thing I should point out with respect to cost is that I bought much of this hardware from AliExpress, which may be the planet's biggest purveyor of cheap Chinese electronic junk. You can buy all the same stuff from Amazon, but at a significantly higher price. You may not be willing to risk doing it that way, and at best it will cost you a lot of waiting time. But I will say that nothing I bought was dead on arrival, and only one thing has failed so far to my knowledge. Your mileage definitely may vary, so caveat emptor. Having said that, here's an itemized breakdown of this gadget as it stands, meaning only the unit cost of the components in it and the sensors I actually have installed at home. It's a mix of AliExpress and Amazon purchases, so you could certainly spend more, and it just as certainly could be done for less. For example, I bought a $10 power adapter and a $10 enclosure from Amazon because I needed them now, where similar items from AliExpress would have been more like $2 each. But even there, you can pay more for some of these items if you don't shop carefully. On balance, I think the total is in the ballpark, although probably a bit high. Before I wrap this up, I'd like to touch on the subject of making this video while away from home, which was a bit of an adventure in itself. I'm on vacation, so I gave only minimal thought to the idea of doing a video before I left. But I came down south to see and photograph last week's eclipse, which was great, by the way. Here are a couple of photos that I can't resist showing. That meant I had a pile of camera gear with me and my laptop, but very little else to work with. No green screen, no stream deck, no audio interface, no multi-light setup. You get the idea. That actually provided the opportunity for another challenge for wrapping up this project. Just how minimal a setup could I use to film a YouTube video about it? I did have an HDMI cable and one of those $5 HDMI to USB converters, along with a cheap microphone intended for mounting on a camera. And I had one of my cheap video lights that wasn't being used at home, as well as a pocket-sized USB light. My laptop will run OBS Studio, which is what I normally use to record my videos, and it can also run DaVinci Resolve for editing, as long as I'm willing to wait long enough. So with a borrowed monitor for a poor man's teleprompter, I should be set, right? But there was one more experiment in minimalism that I wanted to try. One of my AliExpress purchases during this trip was a micro PC, which I bought for an astonishing $98.55 on sale at the time. It has a low-end Intel N100 quad-core CPU, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and a 512 gigabyte solid-state drive, and it even came with Windows 11. So naturally that raised the question of whether you could actually record decent video with something that fits in the palm of your hand. I gave it a try, and here's the setup in my sister's dining room. She had no idea what she was letting herself in for. There were some initial problems getting audio through the camera's HDMI output to the computer, and Windows is a bit prone to occasional USB audio glitches that required some re-recording. Also, I needed to conjure up the world's cheapest light diffuser using a Walmart grocery bag. But you have in fact been watching the result. It may not be the best video quality ever, but truthfully, that's as much down to the lighting as anything else. So my bottom line verdict is, yes, you can make a YouTube video with a $100 computer and some very cheap peripherals, as long as you have a halfway decent camera. This is shot using a Sony RX100 V7, which I actually prefer for a lot of purposes to the bigger and more expensive cameras I brought with me for the Eclipse. That's it for this video. If you stuck it out, I hope you enjoyed it. Give it a like if you did. Feel free to subscribe to the channel. And thank you very much for watching.